Right, yeah, as Dr. Hammond said, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, he's one of my heroes, not just because of what he did, but his writing is impressive. Well, certainly in English. I can't read Russian, so there's that. But he personifies not only a country, but a period of history. And although he died a while back and his writings covered from 1914 up to about the early 60s, his writing is still valid today. Very good novelist. Literally wrote world-changing books and people-changing novels. I don't know if we've got any in the library. We do, okay. I recommend them to you. I haven't seen them new. You have to buy used ones, but they're brilliant. He was called a colossus of courage and one of the most courageous Christians of the 20th century. He lived through some of the momentous times of the history of the world, and his books, both fiction and non-fiction, were semi-autobiographical. In other words, he was writing about himself and the situation he was in. He went from prison and banishment to restoration and appreciation in his homeland. Alexander Isayevich Solzhenitsyn. I'm sure Frank can read that, yeah? Yeah, da. Well, he was shaped by the world he lived in. We all are. We grow up in a certain milieu, and that's why I'm not like an American, okay? I'm sure when you went back to America, you felt sort of out of place, fish out of water. You're shaped by the world you're in. So what I want to do today is just cover a few topics. A look at him, his work, the time he lived in, and first give a brief biography of him. A look at his world, a look at his books, and then his time in the West and his faith. So first of all, this isn't working. We've got young Solzhenitsyn. He was born in 1918, the last year of the First World War, after the October Revolution. So the whole communist thing was settling in Russia. He was in Kislovodsk, southern Russia, and his father was an artillery captain who died before he was born. So he never had a father, in effect. He was raised in Rostov, grew up in post-revolutionary Russia under Joseph Stalin, of whom you may have heard, was thoroughly indoctrinated into communism at school and university. It's important to know that. He was a communist. He believed in it early on, lived it. His mother encouraged his interest in literature and science, and he was accepted at the Rostov State University, graduating with degrees in mathematics and physics. Then between 1939 and 41, he took correspondence courses in literature from the Moscow Institute of Philosophy. And you can imagine they were heavily slanted courses, communist to the core, Marxist to the core. He wanted to be a writer, but he had no success. From 1937 on, he began writing a book about the First World War and the Revolution. This eventually appeared as the Red Wheel series, with what he called nodes or knots. August 1914, November 1916, March 1917, April 1917, accounted for several long volumes. Just to see where he was born in Kislovodsk, down in the south, and grew up in Rostov-on-Don. This is in the sort of area that the fighting is going on now, which is Donetsk province. The Don River is, I think, the border, or close to the border. He became a student. That's when he was studying. Then in the Second World War, the Germans invaded Russia, and of course he got drafted eventually. He served in the artillery, probably because he was good at maths and physics. You have to know that sort of stuff. And he was decorated several times and promoted to captain. And then when they counterattacked against Germany, he was involved in fierce fighting in exactly the area of East Prussia where the first book of the Red Wheel saga, August 1914, was set. That's as a captain with one of his decorations. And then came the turning point of his life. A young, enthusiastic communist fighting for Uncle Joe, not Uncle Sam. And he relates what happened right in the midst of the fighting. This is part of his biography. Mine probably was the easiest imaginable kind of arrest. It did not tear me from the embrace of kith and kin, nor wrench me from a deeply cherished home life. One pallid European February, it took me from our narrow salient on the Baltic Sea, where, depending on one's point of view, either we had surrounded the Germans or they had surrounded us, and it deprived me only of my familiar artillery battery and the scenes of the last 3 months of the war. The brigade commander called me to his headquarters and asked me for my pistol. I turned it over without suspecting evil intent, when suddenly, from a tense, immobile suite of staff officers in the corner, two counterintelligence officers stepped forward hurriedly towards me, crossed the room in a few quick bounds, their forehands grabbed simultaneously at the star on my cap, my shoulder boards, my officer's belt, my map case, and they shouted theatrically, "You are under arrest!" Burning and prickling from head to toe, not surprising because so many people got arrested, all I could exclaim was, "Me? What for?" And even though there is usually no answer to this question, surprisingly, I received one. This is worth recalling because it is so contrary to our usual custom. Hardly had the Smersh men, if you know James Bond, you'll know that Smersh is death to spies, counterintelligence, finished plucking me and taken my notes on political subjects along with my map case and began to push me as quickly as possible towards the exit, urged by the German shell fire rattling the window panes. Then I suddenly heard myself firmly addressed. Yes, across the sheer gap separating me from those left behind, gap created by the heavy falling word arrest. Across that quarantine line that not even a sound dared penetrate came the unthinkable magic words of the brigade commander. "Solzhenitsyn, come back here." With a sharp turn, I broke away from the hands of the Smersh men and stepped back to the brigade commander. I'd never known him very well. 10 days before, I'd let my reconnaissance battery almost intact out of the fire pocket in which 12 heavy guns of his artillery battalion had been left. And now he had to renounce me because of a piece of paper with a seal on it? You have, he asked Waitley, a friend on the 1st Ukrainian front? "It's forbidden, you have no right," the captain and the major of counterintelligence shouted at the colonel. But I'd already understood. I knew instantly I'd have been arrested because of my correspondence with a school friend, and I understood from what direction to expect danger. And then the brigade commander, also completely out of character and out of all custom, stepped forward, held out his hand and said, "I wish you happiness, Captain." And he got dragged off, arrested, interrogated, and his arrest was prompted by a single line he wrote in a letter, just one line. He referred to the moustached one, Uncle Joe, the guy with the big moustache. He quickly disappeared into a labor camp, part of what was called the Gulag Archipelago, with an 8-year sentence. Now, instead of islands, this archipelago had camps. At its height, listen to the figures, the Soviet Union operated 1,976 concentration camps, 273 prisons, 85 psychiatric prisons, because of course anyone who opposes communism must be mad, and 41 death camps. In this Soviet gulag were incarcerated over 5 million political and religious prisoners. Between 1918 and 1953, that's under Lenin and Stalin's rules, over 50 million Russians served long sentences in the Soviet concentration camps, with millions of them perishing. He was a prisoner, shaved head, overalls, and he served the first part of his sentence in several correctional work camps. You know, you've got to make people think the right way, of mixed inmates, political and criminal. Criminals were real criminals, they were the scum. And so the authorities used them to persecute the political prisoners. Then in 1946, because he was a mathematician, he was transferred to the group of scientific research institutes of the MVD, the Ministry of Internal Affairs, or State Security, and he spent the middle part of his sentence in such special prisons. And he wrote the first of his novels, his novel, The First Circle, using his experience there. And interestingly, the main protagonist there is a prisoner arrested for something, but he remains a committed communist, even though it's the communists oppressing him. Then in 1950, he was sent to a newly established special camp for prisoners at Ekibastuz in Kazakhstan, working as a miner and a bricklayer and a foundryman, and he used this experience in a play. He contracted stomach cancer. It was operated on, but the condition was not cured. However, came another turning point. His life underwent an even more dramatic change. And he quotes this: "Following an operation, I'm lying in the surgical ward of a camp hospital. I cannot move. I'm hot and feverish, but nonetheless, my thoughts do not dissolve into delirium. And I'm grateful to Dr. Boris Nikolaevich Kornfeld, who is sitting beside my cot and talking to me all evening. The light has been turned out so it will not hurt my eyes. There is no one else in the ward. Fervently, he tells me the story of his conversion from Judaism to Christianity. I'm astonished at the conviction of the new convert, at the ardor of his words. We know each other very slightly, and he was not the one responsible for my treatment, but there was simply no one with whom he could share his feelings. I was wakened early in the morning by running about and tramping in the corridor. The orderlies were carrying Kornfeld's body to the operating room. He had been dealt 8 blows on the skull with a plasterer's mallet while he slept. He died on the operating table without regaining consciousness. And so it happened that Kornfeld's prophetic words were his last words on earth. And those words lay upon me as an inheritance. You cannot brush off that kind of inheritance by shrugging your shoulders." That's what he looked like as a prisoner with his number, Chicha 262. And they were searched every day. If you read one of his novels, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, they went out of the camp to work, build things, cut trees, and they got searched on the way back because he couldn't bring anything in. Because prisoners would turn a nail into a weapon, or they'd bring in all sorts of contraband, so they had to be searched every time. After his 8-year sentence, he was actually fortunate not to just get another 10 tacked on. They used to talk about 10ers and 25s because people would finish their 10-year sentence and get another 10 tacked on, just for luck or something. So there were guys who just spent their entire lives in the camps. Just every time it came to the end of their sentence, bang, they got a bit more for some reason. You didn't actually need a reason. But he was exiled for life from Russia, European Russia, to Kokterek in southern Kazakhstan, which was a common procedure. You'd get exiled away from Russia. You went to the provinces, which is now independent. Then he was released. His cancer developed rapidly, and at the end of 1953, he was very near death. However, he was able to go to a cancer clinic at Tashkent, which is now Uzbekistan, where during 1954 he was cured. And he relates the story of that hospital, or a similar one, in the novel Cancer Ward. And during all the years of exile, he taught mathematics and physics in a primary school. This is a guy who's got a degree, but he's in a provincial primary school. And he wrote prose in secret, all his novels, plays and so forth. He'd write them, memorize them, because you can't be caught with writing. You know, that would be a 25-year sentence or worse. So he'd write them, memorize them, and that way if he was searched, nobody would find anything. You can't see in someone's head. Under Khrushchev, who succeeded Stalin when he finally kicked the bucket, after he took over as premier in 1958, Stalin's crimes were revealed and reviled. And incidentally, Malcolm Muggeridge, the English journalist, said, yeah, Khrushchev should know all about this because he was in charge of it. You know, so Harry is saying how bad Stalin was, but he was the guy running it. There was a slight loosening of restrictions. He was able to publish a book for the first time, and that was the first one, little novel, A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, One Day in a Prison Camp. But in 1964, Khrushchev was chucked out and Brezhnev took over. And he fell under suspicion because he'd written a novel critical of the Soviet Union. and he was in danger again. At that time, he took a risk and arranged that his manuscripts of autobiographical books, The First Circle and Cancer World, were smuggled out of the Soviet Union, published in the West, but at home his writings were confiscated by the KGB and banned. In 1970, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for Literature, but he could not go outside the Soviet Union and couldn't receive the award until several years later. Meanwhile, he was wanted by the KGB because he was officially restricted from being in Moscow. In 1973, his main work, Gulag Archipelago, which is 3 volumes about that thick, was published abroad. He was arrested again, charged with anti-Soviet treason, and then exiled from the Soviet Union in 1974. He then lived mostly in Vermont in the USA until the collapse of the Soviet Union. He was invited home by Boris Yeltsin. His citizenship was restored. He was granted a suburban house, and he became a citizen again, although his wife and sons remained Americans. And back in Moscow, he enjoyed full recognition and wide publication. He was very popular, an active and important figure in Russian society, and eventually he met with that guy. You all recognize him? Yeah, Putin. Vladimir Putin, who incidentally was also in the KGB, but he was let out of it at this stage. And Putin then, when he died, he dedicated his statue. He died at 89, August the 3rd, 2008, and his death caused considerable mourning in Russia. The Russians love literature. Have you ever read Russian novels? Tolstoy, Gogol, Dostoevsky, brilliant writers. And the Russians appreciated their writers. It's interesting that even though Tolstoy and Dostoevsky talked about God and the church, they couldn't be banned because they were such traditional Russian writers. So you couldn't, even though the communists disapproved of religion and were atheist, they couldn't do anything because these are such famous Russians and they're the soul of Russia. Someone said that these were like God's secret agents, smuggling in all these subversive ideas through their novels. So there was considerable mourning. He received a state funeral and was laid to rest in a convent cemetery. That's him in later life. But then his world, what was his world like? Well, from 1925 to 1953, Joseph Stalin ruled the Soviet Union. And when we say ruled, he was more autocratic than the Tsar. He just had to look at you wrong and you were dead. Lift a finger and you were off to the camps or to the prison in Moscow. And pretty much all of his associates were killed by him. The clock was ticking if you were a senior communist in Russia. Under his rule, more people were murdered or deliberately starved to death than in the entire First and Second World Wars. It takes some doing. It was said that for 3 generations of Russia, death had a name, Stalin. And it wasn't even his real name. It means steel. His real name was Yosef Vissarionovich Jugashvili, which might account for why he changed it. Some people in that time dropped dead in the streets from starvation. Pow, gone. Others were snatched off the streets or out of their homes by the NKVD. Not a single person was safe. Nobody, no matter what their job, no matter how loyal they were to the Communist Party, no matter how much they shouted or applauded, they weren't safe. No one was safe. Think about that. No one was safe. And to get an idea of post-revolution Russia under Stalin and Lenin, you can turn to another novelist, also a Russian. They love him. Boris Pasternak. He wrote a book called Dr. Zhivago. Now, this is post-revolution. He went off himself to Siberia, hid himself, but then decided to return to Moscow. Only there's nothing working, no railways. So he walked. And he treads along, he says, in the same direction as the clouds. Nor were the rye fields motionless. Now, rye is a major crop. Something stirred in them, something which filled them from end to end with a small incessant rustling, which nauseated Yuri. Never had there been such a plague of mice. They had bred in unbelievable multitudes, such as never had been seen before. They scurried over Yuri's face and hands, and inside his sleeves and trousers at night when he's caught by the darkness and forced to spend the night in the open. They raced across the road by day, gorged and teeming, and turned into squeaking, pulsing slush when they're trodden underfoot. Shaggy village mongrels, turned savage, followed him at a respectful distance, exchanging glances as if to decide on the best moment to fall on him and tear him to pieces. They fed on carrion and did not disdain mice, and eyed Yuri from a distance, moving after him confidently as though waiting for something. The woods and fields offered a complete contrast in those days. Deserted by man, the fields looked orphaned, as if his absence had put them under a curse. And then he gets back to Moscow, and his lover, Lara, meets up with her again. And it says, one day Lara went out and never came back. She must have been arrested in the street, as so often happened in those days, and she died or vanished somewhere, forgotten as a nameless number on a list which was afterwards mislaid in one of the innumerable mixed or women's concentration camps in the north. It's just a picture of what was happening in Russia. The world, said Solzhenitsyn, has never before known a godlessness as organized, militarized, and tenaciously malevolent as that preached by Marxism. Within the philosophical system of Marx and Lenin, and at the heart of their psychology, hatred of God is the principal driving force. Remember that. It's not just about power, it's actually about hatred of God. More fundamental than all their political and economic pretensions, militant atheism is not merely incidental or marginal to communist polity. It is not a side effect, but the central pivot. The main goal is hatred of God. To achieve its diabolical ends, communism needs to control a population devoid of religious and national feeling, and this entails a destruction of faith and nationhood. Communists proclaim both of these objectives openly, and just as openly put them into practice. You heard a bit of it earlier today. Under Stalin, there are show trials where the accused person did not have evidence led against him. He had to prove he was innocent of anything. How do you do that when you don't even know what you're being accused of? People ended up confessing to things they could not possibly have done. You could confess to planning to blow up the Dnieper Dam without any knowledge of explosives, without any conspirators. You don't even live near the place, but you'd admit to it. There's an OGPU man, that was the forerunner of the KGB. He admitted, laughing, and apparently he laughed so much his eyes were watering and he had to catch his breath, that innocent people were arrested, of course. Otherwise, nobody would be frightened. I mean, if you only arrest the bad guys, everyone else thinks they're safe. If you arrest anyone randomly, everybody's a target. In one case, he quotes, a man was, over 18 months, arrested, sentenced to death, pardoned, sent to a camp, released, rehabilitated, and finally given a medal, all for no apparent reason. Completely illogically. And just to reiterate those camps, 1,976 concentration camps, 273 prisons, 85 psychiatric prisons, 41 death camps, 5 million at a time, political and religious prisoners, and 50 million serving sentences at some stage. And there were all kinds of lies about the conditions in the USSR. Everyone keeps hammering the New York Times because they had a reporter there who said there's no problems at all. There's plenty of food. There's so many wagons of food arriving in Moscow that even Stalin goes down to the stations to help unload them. Yeah, right. George Bernard Shaw, the playwright, English, refused to believe there was a famine as he sat in a Westerners only restaurant. Well, of course, they're not going to show him that. In fact, the truth of the famine, especially in Ukraine, was only revealed under Khrushchev. So that was the time that shaped the young Solzhenitsyn. Dedicated communist, completely anti-religious, Soviet Union citizen all the way. Then his books, and I just picked some of them. Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich exposed what the camps were like for other Russians and Westerners to see, because it was zipped, kept closed. Hardly anyone knew what was going on, but now they knew. Cancer ward, about his time in a cancer hospital with pretty primitive treatments, if you read it. The first circle is time in a special scientist camp, doing research for the regime, the Red Wheel series. Then there's a terrifying book, We Never Make Mistakes, top line. This is about set in the war, and a railway worker suspects that a soldier is actually deserting and reports him to the OGPU. And later he confesses he might have made a mistake. Maybe the guy really was on the way to the front and not deserting. And the OGPU man says, never mind, we never make mistakes. Oh, sorry, that was a mistake. For the good of the cause. It's the short book, but it exposes the utter corruption in the Soviet system in terms of education and educational institutions. And then the Gulag Archipelago, which is nightmarish, don't read it at night. And the Oak Tree and the Calf, his 10-year war to outwit the regime and publish his books, hiding manuscripts in all sorts of places, giving them to people to take to the West. Then we come to his time in the West and his faith. I'm keeping my eyes. How many minutes have I got left? 15. Okay, we'll do it. He's given asylum in Vermont after his expulsion from the USSR. I suppose because he was famous, they didn't just off him or send him back to prison. They kicked him out. You're no longer a citizen of the Soviet Union. The local kids learned not to give away where his farmhouse was if strangers asked. And in the West, he realized that firstly, Christianity was banalized. It was made very Mickey Mouse. He's coming from a place where the Christians had to meet in forests. We used to have an organization, I don't know if it's still going, called Underground Evangelism, which specialized in evangelism in the East Bloc, the Soviet Union and others. And you get these grainy films of people being baptized in a forest, in the river. They were serious about their faith. Yeah, it's in the West, Mickey Mouse, I suppose particularly in parts of America. He also realized the West itself was degraded and slowly collapsing. Remember, this is in the 70s. Fatally weakened by secular humanism, giving it easy materialism, lack of conviction and moral corruption, what we see all the time. He harshly criticized what he saw as the ugliness and spiritual vapidity of the dominant pop culture of the modern West, including television and rock music. Have you ever looked at the lyrics of pop and rock music? It's about that deep, most of the time. In 1975, before the US Congress, he says, "Until I came to the West and spent 2 years looking around, I could never have imagined to what an extreme degree the West had actually become a world without a will. A world gradually petrifying in the face of the danger confronting it. All of us are standing on the brink of a great historical cataclysm, a flood that swallows up civilization and changes whole epochs, which had already happened in Russia and Eastern Europe." Then he was invited, because he's popular now, he was invited to give the Harvard commencement address. And he was said to have flayed the West. He said this: "The Western world has lost its civil courage, both as a whole and separately, in each country, each government, each political party, and of course, the United Nations. Such a decline in courage is particularly noticeable among the ruling groups and the intellectual elite, causing an impression of loss of courage by the entire society." Boy, he was prescient. You ever heard of Joe Biden? Guy without a backbone?
Sleepy Joe.
Sleepy Joe, yeah. And Jimmy Carter, also without a backbone. Of course, there are many courageous individuals, but they have no determining influence on public life. Political and intellectual bureaucrats show depression, passivity, and perplexity in their actions and in their statements. and even more so in theoretical reflections to explain how realistic, reasonable, as well as intellectually and even morally wanted it is to base state policies on weakness and cowardice. Jimmy Carter. Back off from any trouble. And he went on, and then he got flayed. He was now persona non grata. Then he spoke at the Templeton Address, and it contained these memorable lines. More than half a century ago, while I was still a child, I recall hearing a number of older people offer the following explanation for the great disasters that had befallen Russia. Men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened. The West, he said, has yet to experience a communist invasion. Religion here remains free. But the West's own historical evolution has been such that today it too is experiencing a drying up of religious consciousness. And boy, you can see that. Even in America, even in the Bible Belt. You can see it here. You'll find when you go out on the streets, just giving tracts. You don't even have to approach people. Black and colored people will take them. White people don't want it. It's uncanny. They just turn away. And then there are his words from an essay called Live Not by Lies. Let the lie come. Let it even triumph, but not through me. There's a line in Cancer Ward. Because you're not allowed to say things. You get cancelled, right? You're not allowed to say there's only two genders. Oh, J.K. Rowling is finding this out. You get cancelled if you say the wrong thing. And it was the same then, only it wasn't about gender. And the line is this: if decade after decade the truth cannot be told, each person's mind begins to roam irretrievably. One's fellow countrymen become harder to understand than Martians. I meet with family who've studied at UCT and other places. And I start to wonder, are we even speaking the same language? Because the words we use have different meanings. Social justice, what does that mean? Well, it means you have to kowtow and give away stuff to people who haven't earned it and so on. I've got one relative who says, he's a good Marxist, everybody deserves a home. Even if they don't work and they're on drugs and whatever, everybody deserves a home. Huh? And the essay goes on to say this: in our timidity, let each of us make a choice, whether consciously to remain a servant of falsehood. Of course, it's not out of inclination, but to feed one's family that one raises his children in the spirit of lies, or to shrug off the lies and become an honest man worthy of respect by both one's children and contemporaries. And from that day onward, he will not henceforth write, sign, or print in any way a single phrase which, in his opinion, distorts the truth. And again, this is true for us now. Will utter such a phrase neither in private conversation, nor in the presence of many people, neither in his own behalf, nor at the prompting of someone else, either in the role of agitator, teacher, educator, nor in a theatrical role or TV. Will not depict, foster, or broadcast a single idea which he can only see as false or a distortion of the truth, be it in painting, sculpture, photography, technical science, or music. Science these days says there's no difference between male and female. You just have to declare. You remember, Bill Nye, the science guy? There's as many genders as you want. And he carries on with things like that. Will not vote, raise his hand to vote for a proposal with which he does not sincerely sympathize. Will vote neither openly nor secretly for a person whom he considers unworthy or of doubtful abilities. Will immediately walk out of a meeting, session, lecture, performance, or film showing if he hears a speaker tell lies or purvey ideological nonsense or shameless propaganda. Will not subscribe or buy a newspaper or magazine in which information is distorted and primary facts are concealed. That again includes TV. Finally, I want to present to you Solzhenitsyn the Christian, because he became a Christian. Not like us, he didn't raise his hand in a meeting and pray the prayer of commitment and so on. his was a hard one in prison. And in fact, he once said, "Thank you, prison, for opening my eyes, for making me what I am." Because if he hadn't gone to prison, he would have carried on a good communist, captain, maybe eventually colonel or something like that, retire, get a job teaching at a university. But prison opened his eyes through Dr. Feldman. He is Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, but not sectarian. The Russian Orthodox Church liked him, but not really liked him. In one day in the life of Ivan Denisovich, one of his friends in camp is a young Baptist who continually keeps telling him to pray. Alyoshka tells him to be grateful that he is in prison, as he is in time to contemplate. And he wrote, "Bless you, prison, bless you for being in my life. For there, lying upon rotting prison straw, I came to realize that the object of life is not prosperity, as we are made to believe, but the maturity of the human soul." And he also, in prison, noticed the difference between Christians and other prisoners. Everyone was lumped together. People who'd said the wrong thing, or even just knew the wrong people, or were just picked up, or actual criminals. And he noticed the difference. Christians, he said, knew very well what they were serving time for. And they were unwavering in their convictions. They were the only ones, perhaps, to whom the camp philosophy did not stick. Sounds like St. Paul again. And Solzhenitsyn describes the Christians' self-confident procession through the archipelago, a sort of religious procession with invisible candles, a steadfastness unheard of in the 20th century. The Gulag could not touch these people who were sustained by their faith that they were loved by God. And again, his words, "I've spent well nigh 50 years working on the history of our revolution. In the process, I've read hundreds of books, collected hundreds of personal testimonies, and have already contributed 8 volumes of my own towards the effort of clearing away the rubble left by that upheaval. But if I were asked today to formulate as concisely as possible the main cause of the ruinous revolution that swallowed up some 60 million of our people, I could not put it more accurately than to repeat, men have forgotten God. That's why all this happened." Are we forgetting God in South Africa? I think it's happening. And you can see the results happening around you. Thank you.